last week, Keir Starmer laid out his plan for change, detailing 6 clear milestones for the government over the life of this parliament. These milestones provide accountability. It's a metric for us all to hold the government to account. And in the wake of the declaration, Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner was wheeled out for the Sunday morning media rounds to sell that first milestone, building 1.5 million new homes by the end of this parliament.
This target has huge ramifications for the government's mission for economic growth. New building projects create new jobs, which injects more money into the economy. However, these targets are ambitious. If the government does pull it off, it would be the biggest home building initiative since the Second World War. And the plans for implementation for now seem a bit rocky and hinge on buy-in from local councils. Here's Angela Rayner speaking to Sky News' Trevor Phillips.
If they say they cannot deliver this or will not to deliver it, what are you going to do?
They have to compulsory have the plan.
But what happens if they say, no, I'm not going to do it? What are you going to do?
Well, ultimately, if they don't have a local plan, then we will have to look at delivery. But they will have a local plan because they know that that's what they need to do. Councils are going to say, we have to have a local plan. We will deliver a local plan.
They can have as many plans as you like. OK, but what I'm hearing is that there'll be councils who will stand in your way.
Not exactly a confidence-inspiring answer there. So to help us make sense of the government's ambitious targets, we're joined by Vicky Spratt, housing correspondent at the newspaper. Welcome to Pod Save the UK, Vicky.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, how do you feel watching that? Did it inspire you with all your housing knowledge?
I mean, does planning policy inspire anyone? I think that's probably the question. Me a little bit, yeah, actually, but I'm a complete nerd. I mean, look, the government's in a really, really difficult position here. They have got to get homes built. I mean, unless you are incredibly rich, you are at the sharp end of the housing crisis right now. You will be experiencing it, whether that's because buying a home has got more expensive, your rent's gone up, or you're trying to get social housing and you can't. There is pretty much nobody in this country who's not impacted by this. But there is a reason that we have a housing crisis, and that is that it's been very difficult to get the homes we need built in recent years. Now, Labour, I think, are doing all the right things. I think most experts agree, but is that going to be enough? I don't know if it will be.
So let's just start with this kind of policy around the local councils. Is Angela Rayner saying they have to do it enough to actually make councils act on this here?
I think in that clip, what you're seeing is somebody trying to say, you have to do this, but I can't make you.
Yeah, right.
Right?
That's a concern,
so she's saying, you've got to do it. You've got to produce a local plan. But there is actually no way of the government reinforcing that and making them deliver the local plan. Actually, very, very similar tough talk from previous Conservative Housing Secretary Michael Gove. This time last year, I'm getting quite bad déjà vu. I remember sitting at RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, and listening to Michael Gove give a similar speech, which was like, if you don't have a local plan, I will come in and I will make you do a local plan. And I think that's kind of what Angela Rayner is saying. But there's a very, very interesting point in that interview with Trevor Phillips, which I think we need to pay attention to, which is, and then we will have to look at delivery if they're still not able to do it. So what she's hinting at, and I don't know if this would ever happen, is the government stepping in to deliver houses. So the way it works at the moment is that local authorities are responsible for the delivery. So the government is not going to come in and impose on one particular part of the country, okay, we're going to build these homes. They have to do it themselves. But she is hinting and saying, if we can't get these homes built, maybe it's going to change. Maybe that is what's going to happen. Maybe the government will just come and put the homes in. But I think that would be, particularly for a Labour government, a real shitstorm, because the papers would go nuts. They would say it was like Stalinist imposition of state housing or whatever hyperbole they usually come up with when Labour does something quite sensible, like, I don't know, building houses so people aren't homeless.
Yes, I'm reminded of, are you going to nationalise sausages?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's giving that particular debacle. But we have been here before, before they were scrapped under Liz Truss, lest we forget, we actually had compulsory house building targets and we never met them.
So why didn't we ever meet them? I know there's something of a skills shortage within the sector. What are the other hurdles?
There are lots of reasons why we are not building homes and why we don't have enough, and I should say truly affordable houses.
Yeah.
You may have noticed that we're sitting in West London. If you walk around certain parts of this bit of the capital, there are lots of empty houses, but they are multi-million pound, billion pound mansions that nobody can afford. We need affordable homes that people can actually get into. We've got over 1 million households on social housing waiting lists. I would say that's the most urgent part of the housing crisis that needs addressed. We also have a problem with planning, which is why local authorities are being told they've got to deliver, and why all of these local plans are being demanded, why something called the NPPF, that's the National Planning Policy Framework, is being overhauled to make sure that these targets are in place. That's because you really, really have to convince local people to allow for developments to be put in their areas. And we have had really low planning approvals.
Right.
People don't want homes in places where we urgently need them, like the home counties. I was actually having a conversation with someone about this last week. It was like, they want to build houses near me and there's just not the infrastructure. And I was like, I could build a road. I don't. Yeah. They're gonna sort it out. I wouldn't worry about it. But that's really just because people are worried about the value of their homes, or they feel nervous about their area becoming more built up. That's going to be another really big challenge. You mentioned the skills shortage just there. We've got two big things happening in construction. One is that since Brexit, lots and lots of construction workers have left.
Yeah.
And the other is that because for a long time, people from other countries were working in our construction industry, we've not trained up future generations to work in construction. And it's an incredibly skilled job. It's often not spoken about as a skilled job, but it really, really is if you want good quality housing. And lots of our most skilled construction workers are retiring, and there is just not the workforce to take over from them.
That's such a difficult and sticky problem, because how do you fill a skills gap quickly, especially when you've done something that potentially might put people from other countries who have those skills off from coming here and working. On Thursday, so as we record, Angela Rayner is expected to introduce plans to allow for building on greenbelt land that the Times describes as being bigger than Surrey, which is a very funny way of measuring anything. Like, I'm going to start using that. That sandwich was bigger than Surrey. The plan is expected to create a broader definition of low quality green belt land that could be built upon. So earlier this week, headlines sort of fell out of her saying that we need to prioritise people over newts, which is an interesting way of phrasing it. People do have legitimate concerns about conservation and the environment, right, Vicky? So how do you balance legitimate concerns about conservation and the environment with building on bits of the country that have the space for new houses to be built on?
There's so much to unpack here.
Yeah.
Firstly, I say the Times definitely know their audience. If you say something's bigger than Surrey, you're going to sell newspapers if you're to Times readers.
Surrey is the world, Vicky.
Surrey.
There is only Surrey.
Exactly.
And South London.
For the context for international listeners, Surrey is a county that refuses to claim my hometown of Croydon of being in it. Croydon is technically in Surrey, but people in Surrey do not want Croydon to be associated with the rest of Surrey.
Croydon, also my hometown. I'm quite happy for us not to be in Surrey.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have time to get into that because we've got to talk about news.
Let's talk about the news. Let's talk about the news rather than the fact that we're both from Croydon.
The news, right? This isn't about news. I thought that was a really, really good soundbite from Angela Rayner, and actually was an interesting example of Labour sort of playing the Tories at their own culture wars game by saying, well, we're not going to protect the newts. We're going to make sure people have homes. But newts aren't the reason why we have a housing crisis. Macroeconomics, mortgage lending, I could go on, planning. That's why we have a housing crisis. I think it's completely possible to build homes and make sure that we're not ruining the countryside or the ecosystem. I think that we have regulations in place that look after both of those things. I don't think that's what this is really about. And I think the green belt is also a bit of a red herring. I'm not saying we should concrete over all of our beautiful green and pleasant land. I don't think anybody is saying that. The truth about the green belt is that a lot of it is brownfield. There is a lot of what's called low value land in the green belt that we could quite easily build on and still have lots of beautiful countryside. This isn't about concreting over national parks. I don't think that's something that's on the table. And I think for Labour to come in and redefine those low value bits of the green belt as what's going to be known as grey belt is actually very smart. And it's also worth noting, guys, that like none of these announcements are new. So for papers like The Times to now be very, very worried about what's going to happen to the green belt's a little bit disingenuous, because they have been upfront about this and they consulted lots of experts. And there were also Conservative MPs previously who said that the green belt maybe needed to be reassessed. I mean, it was brought in the 1900s. The world has changed. We've got lots and lots of golf courses that aren't being used that much. Do we need all of them? I think these are legitimate questions to be asking when we've got, and this is such an important point, you know, more children living in homelessness in temporary accommodation than we've had since records began. It's like, do we want to talk about newts and golf courses, or do we want to make sure we've got kids who aren't growing up homeless?
Just thinking about these 1.5 million homes, what is the relationship in terms of funding from the government and private house builders who presumably will make a profit out of this and should be excited that it's going to be easier for them to build? No?
Yeah. Builders want to build.
Yeah.
And that is a good thing. We need them to build. We don't really have mass state house building in this country like we did in the post-war years when we built lots and lots and lots of new homes. So whatever your politics are on this, whatever you think, the fact that builders want to build is good. That's how we're going to get the homes built. But the question about funding for social housing, I think, is the key one. In Rachel Reeves's first budget, they announced an additional 500 million for something called the Affordable Homes Programme, which was set up under the previous Conservative government. Now, that's some money, but it's not enough to build all of the social homes we need to get rid of the waiting list of over 1 million households. So what we're looking at with this 1.5 million target is a combination of private building for private sale and hopefully housing association and council building for social housing. But that, crucially, could also include schemes like shared ownership, which obviously aren't true social housing in the purest sense. They are also effectively private sale homes. And really, I would say, getting social housing built for the people who need it most, reducing that family homelessness and also single person homelessness is vital. So I hope social housing delivery is prioritised out of that 1.5 million. But we also do need the homes for private sale. Like, I live in a one-bedroom flat, which I own. I used the Help to Buy scheme to buy it in 2017. That was amazing for me. But actually, I mean, I don't have kids, but let's say hypothetically I had just had a baby. I don't know how I would afford to buy somewhere with 2 bedrooms so that I wasn't in the same room as my kid, because that's the problem we've got in the housing market now, is people who need to upsize, but everything's so expensive. It's actually very difficult for families to grow, to move on. And that's something this government's going to have to address. Again, like, depending on where you sit on having children and whether people should even be doing that, the fact remains our birth rate is falling. People are having children later, and when they do, they're having fewer. This has to be a huge part of the reason why we need social housing, but we also need affordable, decent homes for those people who want to have families to start having families in.
And how do you achieve that? Should we be looking at things like rent control? Should we be looking at maybe more punitive taxation for the ownership of second homes? I know this is the kind of thing that would probably send the people who measure things in terms of how it compares to Surrey into a sort of like frothing panic about oncoming Marxist dictatorships. But like, stepping away from like the political realities of getting something like that across, isn't that something that would practically be incredibly helpful?
Yeah. The short answer is we have to do something about the cost of housing. Like, you wouldn't think my beat could get people as upset as it does. But if I talk about rent control, the amount of like hate emails I get.
What?
Yeah, it's wild. But so let's take home ownership, and then we can get on to the really.
Landlords have got a lot of time on their hands because they don't have real jobs. So they've got a lot of time to send you emails.
Well, they do email me a lot, but I would say I'm pro seeing being a landlord as a real job.
Yeah.
If If you are a landlord, you are a housing provider. So I like to think that landlords are taking their job very, very seriously.
Like to think is the crucial phrase you use there.
And I would prefer that we called them housing providers and regulated them accordingly. But that's by the by. So being able to afford to buy a house, this is the one thing I think Labour are missing, by the way. I think their housing strategy, housing policy is very comprehensive. I think it's important to point out it's not a million miles away from where the previous Conservative government wanted to be under Michael Gove before he backed down, before it was watered down. They're doing all the right things. They're looking at planning. They're looking at social housing. They're also looking at how we build infrastructure. They're looking at how we reclassify the green belt. It's a real 360 strategy. But the question of who will be able to afford the new homes for private sale hasn't really been answered. I mentioned that I used Help to Buy, very, very controversial scheme. I benefited from it immensely, but reports have shown that it actually inflated house prices. So not all good, not all bad. You pull one lever in this bit of the economy and something else does happen. That's the nature of the housing market. But I think to get credit to first-time buyers who don't have really, really rich parents, something like Help to Buy probably has to exist. Labour have said they're looking at what they're going to do. Every time I ask them, they say they're looking at it, but they haven't announced anything beyond extending the existing mortgage guarantee scheme, which has been in place for a very long time. But actually the take-up of that is pretty low. And it's basically just the government saying to banks, we'll back these mortgages for first-time buyers. But it's not like Help to Buy, which basically gave you a government loan and a mortgage and made buying a flat like mine affordable. No way I would have been able to buy it without that. So I'm interested to see if we get like a Help to Buy reboot or something new. But the reason they won't do that quickly or in a sort of slapdash way, I think, is if you pulled a lever that made it easier to buy homes before we had enough homes, which is what Help to Buy round one did, you might inflate house prices because there's a shortage of supply. So Rachel Reeves and everybody at the Treasury will know this. Everybody at the Ministry of Housing, Angela Rayner's department, will know this. I think they're being very careful about what they announce and when, because the nightmare scenario would be for house prices to go up really quickly from where we are now, which, by the way, is at like a near historic high for house prices. So that would be a disaster. And then that brings me to rent control, just like steel yourselves. I'm agnostic about rent control. I work for a politically neutral paper. I've got no skin in this game. I'm not a landlord. I'm not a private renter. But what I know is private rents are still rising faster than consumer inflation. So renters' rents are going up higher and faster than most other consumer goods. That's a really, really big problem because they're also rising faster than wages. I hear from renters all the time who are prioritising paying rent over other stuff. Clothes for their kids, food for themselves. Holidays, I know that sounds like, luxury at this point in time, but like people need breaks.
Even if you take the basic human morality out of this conversation and look at it purely in terms of economics, we're a service economy, especially people in their 20s. We kind of need people in their 20s to be able to go out and do things and put money into the economy.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, which is like, it means renters don't have enough money to spend on other stuff. And that, at a time when we're trying to grow our economy, is a big problem. Yeah. It's also going to be a problem further down the line, by the way. I feel like I'm sort of like this harbinger of doom where I'm like, by the way, renters aren't going to have enough money to afford to have children. We need people to have children based on our current economic model of people contributing national insurance to fund the welfare state, to fund the NHS, to fund adult social care. If our generation doesn't have children, there'll be no workers in the future paying into the system when we're old. Yeah. It's a big problem that people aren't saving. And it's having an impact on the economy. But what I would say is the Renters' Rights Bill, which I'm hearing should become law next summer, does have measures in it so that rents can't keep going up once you're in a tenancy. Yeah. Right. And there will be an independent tribunal that you can go to if your rent is going up like that and you can challenge it. Some people are very upset about this, people on the right, and they're calling it soft rent control. I mean, I think it's rent regulation, but arguably necessary regulation. Because as we've just sort of outlined, what happens if you don't do something about people's rents going up? And if your rent goes up and you get evicted or you have to move, that's very disruptive. You can't find anywhere else you can afford to live in the area. You either move really far away, have to take your kids out of school, maybe you have to change job, maybe your commute doubles, or worst case scenario, you become homeless. And that's why we're seeing that number of families with children living in temporary accommodation, which, by the way, is really expensive for the taxpayer. That's not why it's so terrible. It's terrible because it's poor quality and it's a horrible place to be, but it's not good value for money for the taxpayer. So actually limiting in-tenancy rent increases in the Renters' Rights Bill is the right thing to do, because it will bring stability to renters, which is also, in the end, good for the temporary accommodation bill, good for homelessness numbers, and better value for money for the taxpayer.
The picture you painted when you talk about children in this horrific temporary accommodation and just the number of people in desperate need of secure housing going up and up and up, is 1.5 million even the right number? Maybe it needs to be higher.
Maybe it does need to be higher, potentially.
Yeah.
What I would say to that is we can only build the number of homes that we can build. So I think 1.5 million is a really good place to start. And if it were higher and we couldn't build them, then everybody would just say that Labour had failed and, you know, something's better than nothing.